computer. Okay, Tim, you want to start us off here today?
Sure. I just thought I'd get this started right off the bat. So I assume you can see my slides?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Michael, for inviting me to speak. It's so exciting for me to be able to talk with an international audience and to reach out and to connect with some of my colleagues in the United States that I don't get to see very often, and we've been deprived of our chance to talk face to face. So this is a great experience for me, and I'm grateful. A lot of the work I've done in my career has been through the evolution of crisis communication, beginning with crisis communication as a corporate only kind of structure, dealing primarily with apologia, but then expanding into all forms of organizing, public relations, and the development of multiple types of messages. I evolved about mid-career to working more with the government agencies in the United States, with the Centers for Disease Control, Department of Homeland Security, United States Geological Survey, United States USDA for agriculture, all these groups. So I've done tremendous amounts of work with funded research for these agencies, helping them solve problems. And I think that's really helped me to build a broad perspective of crisis communication. And throughout that evolution, I've really dedicated myself to contributing to the theory building process that goes on. And so tonight we'll talk about one of those theories that we're working on building that, again, comes from that comprehensive view, moving beyond just image and image repair to seeing crisis as a major entity, a process in what constitutes an organization and what constitutes a socially responsible organization. So I look forward to our conversation. The ground rules that I have as a speaker are very limited. In fact, I can't think of one, except if you can't hear me, let me know. But if you want to stop and interject a question or add a point anywhere along my presentation, that's great. I'm going to stop at least 4 times along the way myself and solicit some sort of questions or input of some kind, just because that's the way I want to do this. I want to talk with you instead of just spend this evening talking to you. So anything else that you want to hear about me or from me before I get started? I'll keep rolling then. As I said, I've had the pleasure of observing crisis communication grow and evolve in our discipline. I actually, although I have 3 decades of work as a professor, I wrote my master's thesis on crisis communication and my doctoral dissertation. So I was in the very early stages of writing about crisis communication, back when every time that we sent an article to a journal, we had to hold back and calculate our analysis so that we leave enough space for a 2-page argument for why crisis communication fit with the communication discipline. So it was a never-ending battle in the early years in the late 1980s to really awaken journal editors to what was going on. And it just has gotten easier since then. And I always want to plug the fact that at the University of Central Florida, we host the International Crisis Communication Conference, Risk and Crisis Communication Conference. And that participation and people's support has led us to work together to create a journal. And so we now have a specific journal sponsored that's dedicated to crisis communication, and that's a long time coming. So that's the Journal of the International Journal of Risk and Crisis Communication Research. So always plugging that. And this is a book maybe some of you have seen. We've got a new edition where we talk about theorizing crisis. Early on, we had some studies in apologia, so a lot of theory there. And we have theory that focused on some image repair, some of that dealing with narrative, some of that getting into more moving evolution toward attribution theory and image repair. And a lot of war stories. People would tell about their crisis, and everybody had a set of best practices. And one of the knocks against crisis communication early on was that they said that much of your work isn't theoretical. And of course, we knew it was. And one of the reasons that Matt Seeger and I initially wrote this book, Theorizing Crisis Communication, was as a counter argument to people saying that crisis and risk communication scholars weren't using theory. Our first edition, we identified 40 theories that had been used and used repeatedly to adapted to fit with crisis communication, some of which were new. Our second edition found even more theories, and again, more than a dozen theories that are, and models that are specific to crisis. So developing our own niche. So those of you studying crisis communication and corporate social responsibility, I'm so happy to see this whole influx of bright, young talent coming in. And I hope that some of us have opened some doors, and I know you'll open more. So very exciting. And that's, I mention all this background mainly because I wanted to talk about how we're building our theory in instructional risk and crisis communication. And I always start out with talking about what I call the 3 texts. And they teach this in writing, but I think we've always got our text, and that we're studying and building theory about the messages that we provide publics. And that's our public relations, the relationships we build, how we organize. Our interaction with publics is really the mainstay of what all of us here tonight study. And then there's the context. For me, it's risk and crisis and image repair, whatever your context might be. But what I like to think about is the subtext as well. What's your ultimate purpose? It might be unstated. And that is what motivates the author. That's what inspires the person, the mind behind the hands that are on the keyboard. Why are you doing this? And I want to talk about why we're doing some work with instructional risk and crisis communication. And I hope it'll make you think about why you're doing the research you're doing. What is your subtext? What is your deep meaning, the bottom of your iceberg? Well, for me, and the subtext that really drives me is the phrase that when I was working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention early on, back during the, actually shortly after 9/11 with the anthrax crisis that we had in the United States, the phrase that Barbara Reynolds kept saying was, the right words at the right time can save lives. And she was the director of risk communication for CDC at that time. And it made so much sense to me. And it's really become a part of who I am. It's a part of my subtext. And I would add to that for me, a crisis doesn't need numbers. If one life is lost that could have been saved, then to me, that's a crisis. And that's why if we could have done something different with the way we communicated, and that life would not have been lost, that person would not have been injured, then that's what keeps me coming back to the keyboard, keeps me thinking, keeps me inspired to write. And so think about it. What is driving you? What is your subtext? I also like to think about risk communication. I thought I'd just lay a little context there. We know that when we think about risk communication, we're really trying to increase the quality of people's decisions on many levels. How can we increase that quality? And as practitioners, we're very interested in coping with the fact that we know our risk message that is meant for good might be manipulated for benefit, might be politicized, as we've seen with what happened with COVID-19, why some people resist the simple instructions that could reduce their danger, why they put others at risk with their behavior. This is something that shouldn't surprise us. This is something that as practitioners, all of us need to think about. what's going to happen to that message when we release it into the wild, when we share it. So very important to kind of lay that groundwork. And just to reiterate what I said earlier, that crisis communication is more than image repair. If you are into crisis communication and you're studying image repair, that's great. I wouldn't belittle that. I won't diminish that. But keep in mind that crisis communication is also crisis planning, disaster warning, crisis recovery, crisis learning. How do we come away from a crisis better than we were? And crisis renewal. Can we see the organization entirely different? I put the picture of a broken lamp there because that's an argument that Bill Benoit has used frequently when he said, here's why I don't talk about image repair anymore. It's always, or image restoration, it's all image repair. If I break a lamp, I can't restore it, I have to repair it. And that kind of thinking helps us move beyond image as well. When a community is broken, what can words do? What can messages do to help that community recover? If a tradition is lost because of some sort of change or crisis and people's personal identity is threatened, and that's a crisis to them, what can we do with messages to heal that process and to move forward? So just again, this is just, I'm simply laying out a little bit of context. And then we talk about theory construction. And this is sort of getting at the essence of what I wanted to talk about tonight. And some of you had a chance to look at some of the readings that I sent. Putting together a new theory, talking about where we start and how it grows. I just think getting behind that curtain and seeing what's gone on and what we're doing might be interesting for you. And we'll talk about that. And then I'm always looking for input and hoping to get some from our international audience tonight. So when we started theory building and thinking about instructional communication, what we were doing is beginning at the beginning. One of the most influential pieces that has been written on crisis communication was by Sturgis in '94, when he really backed up and took a macroscopic look at crisis communication. He didn't look at the organization, he didn't look at the image, he looked at crisis as its broader impact. And he looked at the kind of suffering that people can endure far beyond that what might be experienced by an organization. He really did expand many of us in the way we thought about crisis and make us see it from a broader perspective. He said the first thing that we need to do is provide instructing information and help people cope physically with the crisis, the danger, what we can do. This, of course, is where our entire instructional crisis communication process begins. And it's what we've locked onto to build a theory because we think it's first and foremost, as did Sturgis. But then there's adjusting information. We understand that, help people cope psychologically with the crisis, might be in the latter stages. And third, and a clear third, is reputation repair. And that is attempts to ameliorate crisis damage that it inflicts on the organization, particularly to that organization's image. The reason I'm so emphatic about saying that reputation repair is a clear third is because I don't think it's the first thing that we're dealing with. I think we've got to take care of people, we've got to protect people in the beginning before we can worry about our image. And that is paramount to me. It's part of my subtext. It's part of how I think and feel as a researcher. So I argue that beginning with instruction is a good example of first and second things. And that's a concept, ethical principle introduced by C.S. Lewis. And what Lewis was talking about is if you don't do first things first and you prioritize something that's secondary, in the end, you'll fail at both. So every preference of a small good to a great or a partial good to a total good involves the loss of the small and partial and good for which the sacrifice was made. In this case, I think it's the well-being of our publics that's got to come first before we focus on our image and our reputation. And so I'd like to begin with that, establish that context, and let you know what we were thinking when we decided, well, what more can we add, or how better can we understand that first principle that Sturgis introduces, instructing, helping people have the information they need to protect themselves, to thrive, and actually perhaps even come out stronger from a crisis. Well, we were fortunate because we already had connections with a lot of different agencies that were willing to fund research if we could answer questions that they were asking. But many of them were asking questions that had to do with how they could better communicate with publics. And all of them said that they valued crisis communication. They needed to know crisis communication. They wanted to be good at crisis communication, but they were really concerned about minimizing crisis, really emphasizing risk communication, or getting on top of a crisis early and having that information, warning about crises. That, in essence, becomes a form of instruction. So that's how we were able to, although we did very different projects for all of these different agencies, we were always thinking about how do you get that information out right away that will protect people, that information right away that will prepare people, that will give them some distance between themselves and the impact of what's coming their way. We also have had a lot of input, lots of chances to talk. We were part of a project funded by the State Department in the United States where we focused on agriculture. And in agriculture, we talked about instructional communication and how to deal with risks dealing with food security and preparation. So we were able to talk in a lot of countries, get a lot of feedback. And although we were certainly speaking about instructional communication, we tried to introduce an intellectual dialogue where we were able to gather information, test our ideas, and try to determine their validity and reliability with an international audience. And in truth, when Michael gave me the chance to talk to you, I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, well, what can I learn here? What can I gather from this international group? And so I'm really going to want to listen to that. And most recently, we had a really exciting project where we've been working with our United States Department of Agriculture, focused exclusively on biosecurity. And we were well into this process of how the United States could prepare their agricultural workers to prevent animal disease spread. And of course, we know that many diseases are zoonotic and they'll go from human to animal and animal to human. And that was part of the process. But when the pandemic hit, several of the principles that we'd worked on for our work with biosecurity were useful and generalizable, and we found an audience for them that was purely a human audience. So when we started to move on and to build this theory, our building blocks were like our ABC blocks. And those of you who are committed to engagement will understand that many of the different propositions that go into engagement involve, from a psychological perspective, affective responses, behavioral responses, cognitive responses. For us, we went to the same premise, the same foundation. For us, our measurable outcomes are affective learning. In our way of operationalizing that is, will people perceive the relevance of our message, value it, see it as useful? And behavioral learning, can we give them self-protected behaviors, and can we watch their behavior as a measure of their success, our success in giving them something meaningful to do in response to the crisis? And cognitive learning, that's that comprehension. Can they understand the principles that we're talking about? Everything that we do when it comes to measuring our success always goes back to the beginning: affective, behavioral, and cognitive learning. It's really the ABCs of instructional communication on any level. So we put our research team together and we decided, what is our goal? And at the time we were funded by the Department of Homeland Security, trying to develop warning messages and instructional messages so that people would understand when there was a food poisoning problem, helping them to understand what's happening, what to do, and to measure whether they would respond to our warnings about food safety issues. And so with our team, we came up with these goals. We said that we wanted to create a model that would be designed for effective instructional risk and crisis communication that would be based on rigorous, theoretically grounded empirical research, yet be easy to use. That was a criteria from all of our funding agencies. Will we be able to use it? Is it simple enough that it would empower people to make informed decisions, going all the way back to that quotation for risk communication that was first developed by Palanchar and Heath. Is one of the first times I've read it in 2004. That would result in appropriate self-protective actions, watching that behavior, mitigate harm, and going all the way back to that key subtext, save lives, making sure that we can save lives with this process through instruction. What we built was the idea model, and you've had a chance to read that. We've been working on this for quite some time, have a number of publications out, and I'll describe it briefly and then we'll break it down and show some examples and then get input from you. That's what's coming. But here are the components just as a reminder. Internalization is the first component of the model, and that is that it answers the question, am I or those I care about affected and how? Distribution is always thinking about what's the best way to share this message, make sure that people are getting our message or that we are addressing competing information. Explanation, always providing some information that talks about what happens in the message, what's going on with the crisis, what's happening, and then most importantly, I think the ultimate, once you have buy-in with internalization, is to provide action, helping people understand what to do. And those of you who had a chance to read some of what I sent will know that all of our content analyses in the first decade of testing this model showed that when we got all the information people were sharing in terms of a food safety situation, a product recall, an oncoming storm system. No matter what context we looked at, it was always explanation that dominated. For whatever reason, we could find very little action and almost no internalization. So that when agencies would speak, they wouldn't define their audience. When media sources would cover those messages, they wouldn't define who would be at risk. They would focus primarily on, here's what's happening and here's how bad it can be. And we thought we can do better than this. And how can we build this model, make it simple, and help people understand why all four components are necessary? Get in with some of these agencies and do some training. That became our goal. So tonight, I want to show you some of how this theoretical approach is maturing, and then talk about some examples of how we're applying it. I'll go through each of these elements, and then I'll use an example of recent research that talks about how we've dealt with that particular dimension, and then I'll ask you some questions too. So with internalization, we'll talk a little bit about some mudslide dialogue that we're engaged in Uganda with with both the population and with the Office of the Prime Minister. And for distribution, we'll talk about some pandemic planning work that we did and are doing. For explanation, I've got to fix that for explanation, I'll talk about the World Health Organization and a process that we were engaged in before COVID-19, helping them develop a risk communication protocol that can be shared internationally. And then some actions, we'll talk about the USDA project I already mentioned. And then I've got a compressed example. If we have time, I'll share that at the end. But I'll start off with just talking about the engaged dialogue process that we're going through in Uganda's Bududa district. Near Kenya, the mountains begin while still in Uganda. On these mountainsides, farmers for hundreds of years have grown a rotation of 5 to 7 crops. This is very rich soil, and the weather gets more rainfall than on the flatlands. In Uganda, it has richer soil, and the climate is conducive to raising everything from bananas to coffee beans to corn to onions to and many other plants. A farmer with a few acres on the mountainside can create an economy through trade stations that puts them at a relatively comfortable life. They live simply, but they live in a rich culture of support and spend a lot of time together enjoying their lives and enjoying the land. As the farmers have been successful, their children and the population has grown, which is good, and they've moved further up the mountain onto steeper terrain to establish new farms and expand existing farms. With changes in the climate, with different forms of rainfall, heavier rains, longer and earlier monsoon seasons, combined with more farmers on steeper cliffs, they're experiencing mudslides and serious mudslides where entire villages can be swept away, and in a single afternoon, 200 people can perish. So when we talk about internalization, we're talking about compassion and listening to the stories of people, listening to their personal impact, understanding in a way with proximity and timeliness how we can help them, exemplars of key events. These folks we know what they're going through, but with our internalization, we began the process in a very unfortunate and confused way. We came in thinking that we were going to help build a warning system so that people could manage the land, and we were coming in to help explain the Prime Minister's position on why he had decided that some land was now unfarmable and that people should move. Well, when we got there, we realized that we were completely off base. We had to listen to that population because the internalization process had to be shared not just with the individuals that lived on the mountain, but with the Prime Minister as well, because their concerns were about leaving this land that was so rich and productive and being moved to land that wasn't productive, to being moved to an area where they would lose their cultural ties, to being, and then on the other parts of the mountain, we found people that wanted to leave, but hadn't been given the opportunity. And so there was this disconnect in terms of what people wanted, what they were receiving, who was getting the opportunity, a mismatch. It just goes to explain how, it just serves as a vivid example how any kind of crisis communication or risk communication needs to begin with that internalization. How do the people impacted understand that problem? How do they internalize that problem? How do the agencies trying to help comprehend that problem? What is the disconnect between the two? Where do they understand each other accurately? So it was a exhausting experience, because I rarely have begun a research project and been that wrong. And so I'm grateful for the time. I'm grateful for the experience, and I'm grateful for this work that we had done that helped me and the research team realize that we needed to stop and take a step back and listen and try to recalculate. And our whole first visit to Africa did not get past phase one. Nothing got beyond internalization. So I'll leave you with that example, and we can talk about that too. But a lot of what we're talking about with internalization is tailoring the message to help people understand it. And I want to always be sensitive to the manipulation opportunity. So I wanted to ask you, one of the things we're always thinking about is when we tailor the message and try to help people understand their risk and to use emotions, that affective emotion to learn, what are the lines that, what are the potential lines that we could be crossing? And I want to share, I grew up in Minnesota, which is on the very northern part of the United States, right in the middle. It's very cold, and it's very difficult life. It's a farming region that I come from, and this is a group of people that tends to be what we would call in the United States terms conservative, and they're really, as COVID-19 has impacted them, they've been very resistant. And they say they've got small communities, and when they close stores and things, and particularly churches, people were very upset. They wouldn't mask, and they're slow to get vaccinated. And with some of my relatives, I want to talk to you about how I tried to help them internalize the message. But what I really want to know is, do you think I took it too far? For all of us, we come from a very large family of our patriarch, which is in this case, my grandfather, who came to the United States in 1897. He fought in the First World War. He came with his parents. They had a family. When he was away serving in World War I, and the pandemic was spreading, many of our relatives, people that we never knew, contracted the flu and died, particularly young people, because back in 1918, the better your immune system, the harder this flu seemed to hit you. And our grandfather lost his 12-year-old sister and to Spanish flu. And for the rest of his life, for 70 years, he kept a picture of her. And this isn't the picture, I couldn't get the picture of her. This is a picture that I could find that looks a lot like the one that he had of this 12-year-old girl with long hair, a pretty happy girl. He kept it on his bedside, and we all saw it as kids, and we all knew that was Grandpa's sister that had perished. And I knew that story from 1918, and I said, please get your vaccine, because otherwise your grandkids are going to be seeing nothing but a picture of you. And just like you only saw a picture of what would have been your aunt that died in 1918. This is what I was saying to my relatives. So I thought it was effective. Do you think I overdid it? What do you think about this whole dialogue or trying to make the internalization? I'm real curious, and talk about anything I've said so far. I know I've talked a long time, but I knew the first part was going to be long. But I really need to hear from somebody, just whatever your opinions might be.
Tim, I think it's a great idea to personalize the story. And some of our work, we have a challenge when agencies they can only send out one official warning, yet they're using that to different levels of risk within the community and different levels of understanding of risk. So when you can have another way of personalizing the risk or making it relevant, I think it's a really important appeal. But I'm interested in hearing how your family reacted.
I'm waiting because they communicate a lot through Facebook, and I did this as a post, closed through Messenger. Not so it wasn't a post, but this is what I've been arguing, and I've been and I recruited my father and sisters to help. So we'll see. They're so
Well, I mean, from a persuasion standpoint, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, you didn't, I wouldn't call it manipulation. You didn't use some fear appeal. I mean, it is designed to make them aware of the risks involved, but you're not trying to override their ability to make an honest decision. You're drawing upon their, something that they're familiar with. So you've got the enthematic nature of this picture.
That's a good point.
It's a good argument. Just, you've got syllogistic argument here about, the risks involved, and don't take that risk. And, if you do, here's what'll happen. So, I mean, it seems to me ethical and a good argument. I don't see it as manipulation in this case.
I would totally agree with that as well. And what I'm really interested in is this how this resonates so closely with the aged but nonetheless valid concept of appealing to self-interest. You know, if you do this, this will be the negative outcome for you, that whole idea of the situational approach to things. But I'm really interested in your idea of internalization and those appeals to, you know, is it people I know and people I care about, and how you then tie that into something like the COVID response, which for a lot of its appeal relies on that greater social good idea, and where that comes into direct conflict with the appeal to self-interest, because people are going, well, yeah, sure, look, I get what you're saying, but I don't want to do that for whatever reason, whatever reason, whatever reason. I understand there's a greater good, but my preferences are more important. And obviously you've achieved, well, hopefully cut through with moving away from that logic-based appeal into something that is far more emotive and emotional. But I'm just wondering then, you know, what if you don't have that? How can you adopt that micro level response, as Amisha was saying, when you've got such a broad spread of audiences? You can't go in and find out what's going to tick all of them into action. So if the appeal to the greater social good doesn't work, but this individual level of button pushing does, how do you resolve that tension?
Right, and it's you know, and other theories start coming into play with our diffusion of innovations. I've never stopped seeing value in Everett Rogers' work. You know, I've seen so many the diffusion of innovation, diffusion models come out. I've never stopped. That all of the different flow steps and opinion leadership. It might even be as simple as influencers sharing personal stories, and this is I'm using this far beyond just my family. This is an example I'm using with people. I started out with the family because it was so poignant, but I'm using it with people in my neighborhood who are hesitant to get a vaccine, and I'm telling them my story, and I tell them how grateful people like my grandfather would have been for a vaccine. I don't know. It's something that.
Well, Rogers is really all about audience analysis. Okay, I mean, you need to know what they want, and that's, you mentioned culture earlier in your example of Uganda, and it seems to me that's, I think, one of the keys here. I mean, to persuasion, the first thing is audience analysis, knowing who you're talking to, knowing what moves them, and that's, I mean, that's a compelling place to start. Is going to be, what are they, you know, what is it that's preventing them, or what would move them?
It's true, and I love it because what we're trying to do is, I keep calling this instructional risk and crisis communication, we keep talking about it as a model because it pulls in all these communication principles, but it puts it in a package that we can give to people on a real pragmatic scale, and to help them with the stories they tell. I know some of you talked about storytelling and its importance, and I think it's fabulous, and engagement. Because really there's so much that these things are closely paralleled. And again, think of this as a way of packaging the principles so that we can encourage people to get involved. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Anybody else? I don't want to cut anybody off because I've got a couple. Yeah, Shima.
May I add something? I don't know how much it's related, but to the topic, but in the engagement literature, we have episodic and relational engagements. And when we pair these two types of engagement, we can build trust and we can engage with our community or lead them to engage with us. I think in the crisis communication or disaster management, what is missing is this relational engagement, because crisis is usually unexpected. So we don't know when the crisis happens and in which community, so that we can have a relational engagement with that community.
Mm-hmm. A lot of sense, and I'm learning more about engagement. It's not I realize that it's not a new concept, but I'm in my most recent writing, referring more and more to engagement and engaged dialogue as part of the early stages of the instructional process. So I think that right now you know more about it than I do. I know a lot, I've read and I'm testing these things, but it's your, it's the essence of what you're studying. And so I appreciate that clarification, that whole relation. This is the kind of thing that when I hear these things, then I learn, I listen, and I learn. So thank you.
Well, I just want to add my individual ideas. When
Yes.
we first observed that the CDC communication activities at the very beginning of the COVID-19, and I feel like that the organization too much, how can I say, sending out so much individualized messages. I'm so concerned in some sense that the early beginning, there are a lot of uncertainties out there regarding even without fully understanding the disease. Some of the message gives some sort of bias or stereotyping the patient or victims in some sense. So
Yeah.
individualization, internalization is the great classic ideas. Is definitely the text in the crisis communication. In some sense, I believe it, depending upon the development of the crisis, or at least the level of uncertainty, probably they giving some more neutralized one, some kind of based on the fact information delivered and fully educated people understand some type of understanding on the causes and what might be the next step. And then probably there might be the next step to giving some sort of personalized or individualized some approaches in the message delivery. There might be another option. I just thought about
Right.
that part while listening to your ideas. Yeah.
Right. And, there's plenty of work to be done just on what is enhances internalization, what strategies are available and what we can do. You make good sense. I appreciate that. And there are, that whole level of uncertainty early on in every crisis. It's not a crisis unless there's uncertainty. I mean, if you know it's coming, then it's an issue and you should be managing it. But, these diseases come on, one that comes on as quickly and evolves as fast as COVID-19 did. As you said, if we're not careful in our internalization, we can even do harm with those that we are identifying as most vulnerable. I mean, we can create some sort of stereotypes and problems, but it takes good care. There's some clear lines to think about. Let's talk a little bit about distribution. I know some of you are studying crisis and social media. That's really interesting. I'm always eager to learn. I know what we're talking about here is finding those preferred channels, and still might be face-to-face, and it still might be whatever we can do. We're still coming to the point for vaccinations where some of what we're seeing is it's going to take the personal position of some people to help them. So if we can distribute the message, if they hear it again when they go in for their checkup from their physician, and that physician can make it easy for them to get a shot. That may be the way that some people at high risk that haven't gone to a vaccination site may get it. Whatever the channel is, and we argue that there ought to be multiple channels and that convergence is important. We have measures that suggest that if people get the same message from multiple sources, that's convincing. And again, we've tested this. We've got a really interesting study going on right now where we're showing convergence in media and divergence in media and trying to see what the reactions are. It's in a quasi-experimental design, wrapping up one of our grants. So I'll be able to report on that soon. But we're also aware of competing narratives, and even intentionally competing, where misinformation and disinformation is communicated through these lines, or malinformation, stealing information and reporting it out of context, whether that be emails or any other kind of cyber crime, and then sharing that is a real problem as well. So But what we do know about distribution is that redundancy is good. We know that identifying preferred channels and getting a consistent message out there is good, and that people will test what they see on television or what they read on the internet, and they will test it with other sources. They'll talk about it with other people. They'll look at other mediums. We know that. We know that people live in echo chambers. That's been a problem. Some of the convergence research we find doesn't give us the kind of deviation we want to see that would show that convergence is better than divergence if in areas of politics and religion. But if we focus on convergence messages with help, a lot of times it's helpful. The problem with COVID-19, of course, that we're all dealing with is that it crossed the line. It went from a health issue to a political issue. And I don't know if it would have happened to the same extent in the United States if it hadn't been an election year, but we'll never know.
Sorry, can I just,
yeah, go ahead.
just to start with, I'm just a little unclear if there's a line between disaster and crisis communication.
So for me, no.
Yeah.
But
so
for other scholars, yes. And the reason, and I can tell you why I don't have that, but.
Yeah. Oh, well, so I just was going to observe when we're talking about medium. I, in my off time, run a small not-for-profit that works with disaster relief in Australia, particularly around housing people. We were founded during the bushfires. And in dealing with that, one of the things we've discovered, or we learnt from talking to people, was that the fires took out a lot of cell towers. So people had no mobile reception and no internet access. And so many of the communication tools were predicated on that people, the only thing they had were radios. And so information on the radio wasn't accurate. They just didn't have the information. So I think that's something that's often overlooked, is that in these situations, the actual physical infrastructure is really important too.
No, that's such a good point. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because when you think about that distribution process in the state of California, the Western United States, a lot of fires, and they happen so fast that distribution is key. And people, they go from source to source to source down to the minimum radio. They begin to lose different levels, but they do a lot with their phones because the cell towers that hasn't been as big of a problem. But the information shared is so valuable from the individuals on the ground, the residents who can say, here's where the fire is, or similarly with flooding we found. And the beauty of it is that a lot of but convergence is important there, and it works because people don't have time to argue, to politicize the crisis or disaster until afterwards. And so we can see convergence of messages in all this distribution happening, and it works, and it works well. People are good at it, and regardless of their political affiliation, they'll help each other. And it is human compassion at its best. So thank you for sharing that, Aaron, because that's some of the best distribution information we have is our work with the California wildfires and then the Midwestern river floods that happen in the springtime.
I think there's also that assumption that everything works the same around the rest of the world, because I think people's initial response is, oh, we'll just use like cell phone notifications and stuff like that. And when there's no cell phone towers, or tsunamis destroyed your infrastructure, what do you do? That understanding of what's happening on the ground is really important.
It is, and I read a fascinating article by some people that are studying how they're dealing with the sharing medical information rapidly across regions in Western Africa. It's very interesting because of the different technologies and how effective they can be with people understanding that that's what they have, and they use it better than we would use it in the United States because they prioritized it. So you've got to know that, which is a good point because I want to talk about it. We'll talk a lot about that again in explanation. One thing I worry about with all this emphasis on convergence, and I'm always preaching it, I worry about desensitization. I always worry that if they communicate as much as I want them to, sometimes that leads to people just, okay, got it, I got it already. Well, they don't, because it keeps changing. And then we set up these banks that people rely in, for example, when there's hurricanes in Florida, a lot of us really make good use of Twitter. We listen to each other that are people that are, because they tweet the people that are closer. I'm about 30 miles in from the coast, but I like to read the tweets of the people that are watching it, the weather and where the hurricane is landing, so I know what's coming my way. And they communicate up and down the peninsula. But those hashtags get hijacked, and all of a sudden we're getting advertisements, and we're getting people trying to be funny, and we're getting, and so I don't know what the answer is, but I just thought I'd pose these two questions if anybody had any response to some of the desensitization or some of the calamity that goes in with new media, especially when it's got some sort of a social network involved, an open network. Any thoughts? Some of you are studying social media and might have the answer for me. And if not, we've talked about some of these things and already. I can move on to, but if I move too quickly, we can always go back. But with explanation, this kind of gets at some of what we talked about earlier, where we can get it wrong. We've got the explanation. You seem to have some sort of a better tolerance for explanation or over internalization, but really we're looking at credible sources, giving accurate information, and making an intelligible translation of what's going on. What's the science of the disease? What's the science of the weather? What's the science of how the fire is spreading? And translating that. And then again, always rhetorical sensitivity, understanding your audience, understanding that we used to talk about numeracy being a problem. People didn't understand their percentages when we talked about risk. We talked about health literacy. Some people know a lot more about health than others. We talk about science literacy, that some people don't really understand some of the scientific principles. They just stop listening. I don't even say all those literacies anymore. I just say risk literacy. And I think that it simply means, how well can I explain the risk so that you can comprehend it? And that's rhetorical sensitivity. So the example that I've been dealing with is the World Health Organization, and I've been part of a group well before the pandemic that was designing, as I mentioned earlier, a sort of a series of risk and crisis protocol, a sort of a template for response. And I've been one of the people that was able to respond to it and to go to Geneva and listen to them talk about it and critique it and present and share some new evidence. And all that was supposed to work when COVID started. And I can't really I'm not blaming World Health Organization, but early on, one of the things that happened is this statement on the left, that World Health Organization, depending on where you go to find it, their statement was, when used alone, masks can give you a false feeling of protection and can even be a source of infection when not used correctly. what they meant that people, that in some of the studies they had with diseases that spread like this, when people wore a mask, they got too close to each other. They went they spent time around sick people. They went into areas that were congested, and they felt safe, and they felt betrayed by their mask when they got sick. They also would wear the mask and then put it back on and put it back on inside out. And so they were basically putting the contaminated side on the, they made every mistake you could think of. And so when more information became available and we realized that this was really, that masks were the way to go, then they had this error, this conflict, this frustration that people, you said, don't wear a mask. Now you're saying wear a mask. They never really said, don't wear a mask. They said that masking alone can cause as much harm as good. And then you had accusations, and not just by the American president, but by others as well, that the World Health Organization was not pressuring China for the information or was favoring China. I don't know how, any way you want to hear it, but explanation isn't easy. And not only do we have trouble with our literacies in terms of science, numeracy, and health, but we also realize that uncertainty in general leads to possible error. And when we make an error, then we wind up having to deal with it. And it can really be a setback. And so what I hope we could talk a little bit about under the explanation phase is, how do you think the World Health Organization is doing? What's your response? How would you rate them? I'm on a panel that is supposed to now go back and review some of the communication.
Mhm.
And I've got some ideas I've shared. I've already shared some of them, but what do you think?
Hi, Tim. Sorry for being late. I'm in in meeting hell, unfortunately, on this Friday or Thursday night. Well, I have a funny story. Jim McNamara and I are doing research right now with the World Health Organization in Geneva to help them on their COVID-19 response.
Awesome.
Yeah. So how would I evaluate it? Well, it depends. Are you going to be evaluating what we're helping them with?
No. What I'm looking at is the that have already come out. They're looking backwards. And then again, I was part of that plan, that group that was doing they had all those mini grants that went out to help build the data set, to help put together the protocol.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on this project led by Marcia Vanderford to respond, to reflect on the process. So it's all about
Interesting.
for me,
Okay.
but I don't know.
So one of the things I learned by working with them was, number one, until COVID, they hadn't had a real public communication strength. That their most important publics were their member states and ministries of health. And right before COVID, they started to make that foray into social media and actually directly engaging publics, which they hadn't done. So they actually had to bring all these new people together who, some of them came from branding, some of them came from all over these different areas. And so that was a huge difference for them. And then second, I love your example about the masks, because we look at their social media and their media every week. And every time they update the guidance, they haven't changed anything. They just update the guidance on masks and airborne or aerosol, or it used to be touch, right? Remember in the beginning it was touch, right? So we had to wash our hands all the time. Then we started wearing masks, not because it was aerosol, but because we were trying to touch our face with our hands that had touched something, right? So, and every time they updated the guidance, everybody attacked them. Why did you tell us this?
Every time.
Every time. And what we discovered was part of their problem was the story of science has been lost about the last decade. So they're having like a parallel path now. They're trying to explain that science is it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. There's never an answer, right? And answers change as new data become available. So they're trying to push this science, that they are the world's foremost science organization, and that actually it's science that they're communicating and that's their task, right? They need to explain how science is not cut and dry. It's not black and white. It's not masks only or hands or hand washing. It's all of the above. And when a new study gets published, they have to update the guidance. So we saw that though, and it was frustrating for them because they're like, we keep telling people how to be safer, how to take these protective behaviors, and they keep coming back and saying, but you've changed. And we're like, we haven't changed, we've updated.
Right. And I've been hearing all this throughout the process too, and it's such a big organization. There's so much going on that I'm not even sure that people that I'm talking to are giving me the information that you're giving them. Isn't that so? It's just. But you're absolutely right. These are health organizations. CDC went through the same thing. They've hired a lot of communication people in the last 20 years. But before that, they didn't have a whole lot. They had very little. And they consider themselves scientists and health scientists. That was a health organization too. And so then when people are critiquing them in terms of their bias, what I've noticed is that outside entities, their critics are defining the organization's mission and then saying that they failed on their mission. And it's not even necessarily what World Health Organization sees as their mission.
Yeah, so it is fascinating. So I'm curious of your evaluation of them.
You know what, we're so into the early stages that this is supposed to be a post event, like a crisis learning event. It's not supposed to be giving information on the fly like you're doing, like what's happening now, media tracking. It's supposed to be reactive. And so we have a series of meetings that we've only had one so far. So
Well, my people like to meet.
Yeah. And now there's but far be it from me to not want to go to Geneva. But
I know.
I love it there.
Someone else is paying.
Especially when someone else is paying, exactly.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, that's true.
Well, a big part of this too is trust. Like when I see that message you had from, about mask wearing, my response is, well, duh. I mean, there's other things. The mask can't do everything. There's other issues involved. And so, I don't consider an extension of what they've said as some sort of change in policy. But like Maureen said, because of the sort of lack of understanding of science, the distrust of government, the distrust of health organizations too. I mean, because of pharmaceuticals, because of, things the US government has done, experimenting on people. I mean, there's a lot of distrust of the medical community, and some of it's legitimate. And that is another issue, is that you've got different populations. African Americans don't trust health organizations, don't trust hospitals, don't trust police. So you've got some of that too.
And they don't trust China, right? So they have equated the WHO with China. And so it is the whipping boy for whenever you're angry with China, you take it out on the World Health Organization because they're perceived to be close to them. Yeah, it's really, health has become,
so true.
It's so complex now.
Yep, and it's long. It's so long. That's the thing. A lot of disasters. Aaron was talking about the difference. Well, with hurricanes, we complain so much because they last so long. Well, they last 5 or 6 days. Of seriousness. So, there's so much time to criticize and to think back, and so, but yeah, there's so many mistakes that were already made, and there's such a history with trying to put together the United Nations and the World Health Organization. You have their advocates and you have their opponents, and in a time when there's a lot of populist movements in countries, to think about an international agency does not have the ring to it that it has in other time history. So, but it's hard. I'll move on to this action. I think you might be interested in some of this stuff. This with biosecurity. This is where what our job was. One of our key focus areas was on porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. It's a disease which came from China, and it infected it came in feed, it bought from China in some of the minerals and nutrients. It infected the animals, and it kills all the newborns. So it takes out a whole generation of animals, costs millions of dollars. But it can be prevented with biosecurity once it's here, and you realize that you're stopping it through the feed. You've cut that source out. But it was one of those that did spread through a disease that did spread through fomites. And so if people didn't change their shoes, their clothes, or even shower before they went into a facility for young pigs that were being bred by the thousands in some of these closed confined systems, then one person could bring it in and it would spread through the whole barn, and they'd lose a whole generation of animals. It's just sad. And that African swine fever, I don't know if you have it in Australia, but it's not in the United States yet, but it's really bad in China and parts of Africa and parts of Europe. So I don't know, but it's another one that they're working on. And so what we tried to do is look at the biosecurity and help them with their biosecurity measures and training. Again, it's fomites are something that take tremendous rigor to control because they spread so easily. So we were able to develop some training materials, and we used the idea model. Let me just show you how we tried to go at action. I'll show you right here. This should play for you.
Newman knows the issue well. He's not only a veterinarian and animal science professor, he is also a hog farmer and is vice president of the National Pork Board. He helped write the new rules.
We're going to try to create an instant break line of separation on biosecurity. So we require all personnel entering that barn to come all in to the facility with a shower in, shower out facility.
Which means, as we see in this demonstration video, all outside clothing and material remains outside, and workers redress in farm supplied clothing on the inside.
Trucks are a huge issue. We need trucks to get feed on and off the farms to feed mills. We need trucks to get the pigs transported from facility to facility. So cleaning trucks is extremely crucial, and we learned a lot in PEDV about cleaning trucks.
In addition to cleaning trucks, new guidelines call for disinfecting the birthing areas. And feed is now more carefully monitored. No issue has become too small for hog producers to ignore in the face of old or new disease threats.
Good biosecurity protocols will prevent any, disease threat or any unknown disease threat that you have. So that's the benefit of the return on investment for biosecurity is they're non-specific. It helps you deal with the unknowns.
And the unknowns may be around the corner, or at least around the world. A new disease, African swine fever, is a threat and a story for another day. A story we can't risk repeating.
It's nothing I'll ever forget, and anybody that went through it will never forget it.
Not forgetting and keeping up a biosecure line of defense may be the only thing hog farmers can count on to keep them safe. For the news, I'm Ron Blom in Central Kansas.
So these are some of the messages. We've developed messages like this, and we have ways to share them so that they will be received by people that are involved in training their workers, and we're able to test these messages and see their effectiveness. We've got a long ways to go, but we think we've got a good start, and we can continue to develop messages like this. But you can see some of the things we're trying to do, trying to get people that they know, that they've heard of, that somebody who actually farms, somebody they've seen on programming, that one of the people that talked is somebody that's a national expert. He's often quoted on farm channels and those kinds of things, trying to get the people that they trust and respect in front of them, and trying to make sure that those messages kind of go around the different categories of the model. So that's not just do this, do this, do this, but that internalization, showing the story of a farmer that's experienced this and the pain and anguish that he went through. Things like that, listening to their stories. This is what we're trying to do for action, being very specific. But we one of the most telling quotations we got in our interviews was that one of the farmers that went through this huge loss said, we thought we were doing biosecurity, and Ph.D. showed us that we weren't. And they had to change their biosecurity on the fly. And I really think a lot about improvisation, and I try to tell people that we don't want to lock in and tell them that in a crisis that one action is it. And again, I've learned part of this in just watching, this is just another reminder, watching what happened with masking and World Health Organization and all the I think much of it unfair criticism. One of the things we need to say in our action steps, we need to give ourselves room for improvisation. And I'm borrowing from Carl Weick, and Weick says that organizing is improvisation as is sense making, but so is communicating these actions. A quick example that Weick talks about, he gives the example of a jazz ensemble that came on stage, and then someone came on stage and set a fishbowl down, and then somebody came on stage and drew a musical staff on the fishbowl, and then someone else released 3 black fish into the fishbowl, and then the job of the jazz ensemble was to play the notes that the fish swam to. So they were supposed to play the music based on where the fish were, and they kept moving. And it's a great story. But I sometimes think that when we talk about uncertainty and crises, we always have to tell people what we know, but we have to admit what we don't know and let them know that we'll tell them more when we find out, and keep that going. And so we're really trying to encourage improvisation. We saw it so much because people had a biosecurity plan in place, and they got PEDV in their barns anyway, and they had to take it a step further, and that's improvisation. And I think that's really key for me. And so my question is, if we can stop here for a little bit of discussion. I think I'm right, okay? I always thought I wouldn't have said it, but I might be wrong. I mean, maybe as soon as we start saying improvisation, you'll have what I heard one farmer say, fold his arms and say to the next person, they don't even really know what they're talking about, because we didn't have all the answers. We had so much uncertainty. But what do you think? What are your thoughts? Anything anybody can share on that? I think improvisation is good. Will it put them over the edge? Will we lose confidence? I used to say, man, when it comes to action, be clear, be specific. But sometimes we realize that, we have to change our, maybe we'll need a booster vaccine. Things change. It's more real. So never too old to learn new tricks. I'm understanding that hey, got to think about this. Any thoughts?
I think we of course we need to innovate and we need to try different things, but it has to be in some kind of it has to be almost like a controlled experimentation or a controlled innovation, so that we're not manipulating 2 or 3 factors, right? So when you allow people and you encourage people to innovate, that you're not confounding things. So, like that, the showers on the way in, showers on the way out, and then the feed trucks, and then the facility transition trucks, like you almost have to keep those separate. So you almost have to be an experimental designer to make sure that you're only looking at one factor at each time to see if it affects the outcome of a situation.
Good point. Good point. Many times it's do we do? I've got a friend of mine that I taught with at the University of Kentucky, was a great bass fisherman. He's a person one of the really founding people of uses and gratification theory, Phil Palmgren. I would go fish with him, and he would only change one thing at a time, because he wanted to know if that's what was making the difference. He would never, for instance, change both the place he was fishing and the lure he was using, but he would stand in the same place and cast in the same way with 3 different lures to see before he would move. And I, on the other hand, was going by feel. And I would just walk around and cast, and I'd catch a fish, and he'd say to me, and he'd say, so, but do you know why? I'd say, no, I don't. But
now, part of this too, I think, is that people resist change. I think that whole idea that like they don't know what they're doing, there's this unwillingness to this inflexibility that you know, people, we have a built-in inflexibility, hardening of the categories, as we say, right, as we get older, where we don't want to try new things, and we don't want to experiment, and we don't want to change.
And
why are you looking at me, Michael?
I was going to say that sounds like the voice of bitter personal experience coming through there, doesn't it?
I'm all about change, but you know,
I'm about change. I welcome change in my life too.
Timothy, I would just say, because I'm hearing you using stories a lot and using them to great power and effect. And I think this might be something that you've touched on very briefly as well, where, you know, people, they don't know what they're talking about. That's because they, the capital T, they are coming in from the outside and imposing an uninformed perspective. And I love the idea of using not only storytelling, but authentic storytelling, where you get people to provide this information in a way that comes through as being credible and authoritative, because it's real, because it's people who are like us telling us these things. Absolutely. And then you can balance so carefully then because when you come through and you're changing, you know, you wear a mask, you don't wear a mask, you stand on one leg, you hop and whistle Dixie or whatever. That then kind of challenges the authority of the communicator. You know, if you're always changing your mind and, but there's this and, but there's that, then I think people do become a little cynical, and that's where a lot of the resistance comes from. So to get people who are like me, telling me what to do, people who I assume clearly understand what it's like to have all my competing discourses and pressures and everything else. If they say do something, I go, okay, you know what I'm up against. You're telling me to do this. I'll do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I believe them. And that's it. That's why I think that if we can, in this case, if we could get certain farmers to do the biosecurity, or even on a farm, certain workers are more respected. If you spend time in these facilities, you learn they have a clear opinion leaders. And if you don't get that opinion leader's trust, and you're not kind to the people that opinion leader takes care of, then you might as well just quit. And I could tell stories about that. Each facility has a culture, as any organization does. And I'm listening and I'm liking what you're saying. And I do think that when it comes to what we're really doing, and I think Michael said this earlier, is we're persuading, and good persuasion is sometimes good, compelling story.
Definitely. And you let the story do the compelling for you. And what I'm hearing over and over again in your conversations with us today is this idea of how do you get these big, clunky organizational or societal level ideas to become meaningful at that very granular micro individual level? What happens in that transition? How is it made? I think it's just such a fascinating area that you're working in.
No, thank you. And I think that I'm really interested in your work. You're talking about a lot about storytelling too, and I'm fascinated by how that's driving your research and how you're making that happen. And I was just reading a piece by Josh Barbour, I think, at Texas A&M. He talked about putting together mosaics by listening to of an organization's culture in response to a crisis by the pieces, the tiles you would collect through the stories and into a mosaic. And that's big. And the story that the case that he wrote about took years, but I'm a believer.
Oh, good.
Sorry, can I just, when we're talking about improvising, I was wondering if maybe, and I might be way off on this, but it reminds me a bit of agile development and the agile software development.
Agility, yeah.
And this idea of rapid prototyping, it's almost like you're rapidly prototyping your communication messages, getting that feedback and going again, rather than doing this top-down, this top-down, here's the plan, here's how we implement it. It's saying,
and you know what's really good about your comment is that it shows the interdependence, the interdependence of all these elements. And what we tried testing at first, messages that we'd leave the internalization out, and then we'd test it and it'd fail, and we thought it would. And then we'd leave the explanation out and we'd test it and the people would be even less confident, it would fail. We'd leave the action out and they would just be mad. They all work together, because it seems to me what you're talking about goes all the way back to internalization. If you lose your internalization, you can talk about action all you want to, but we know from controlled experiments that it doesn't work, but we also know from just our own experiences that if you don't have people, if they don't care, if they don't feel engaged in the message, then it's going to fail. So I agree with you.
and there's also a risk that you can take a one-size-fits-all approach to internalization.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's so contextual and it's so really cultural, that I think saying, how can we figure out the most effective way to internalize, to help this particular audience internalize is really valuable.
That's true. And I can tell you that I believe that you need internalization, explanation, and action in a message that's going to instruct. But I can tell you that, but what I can't tell you is in your culture, in your context, and perhaps even with your subtext, I can't tell you, I'm not going to say that this is the only way to do it. I can give suggestions, and I can say that you need to meet certain thresholds of rhetorical sensitivity, for example. But, what I've done is I've presented a model, and I showed you why instruction is important, and then I presented a model and then tore it up, and then broke it into pieces and gave examples. And I thought just to kind of be a good steward of information, let me give you just a fast example of the model that worked, and this is super fast. So I know it's getting late and some of you have to go, but this won't take long. We did a project with the Southern California has an earthquake agency, and we worked with them. They're the ones that have Shake Alert. And this is a model on the left side of the screen with the 10 on it. This is something you can get on a computer, and people have it in their home. So you can get this warning when there's an earthquake in Southern California. It takes time for the vibration to hit your home, so they can give you a warning up to 10 seconds. And people have it on their computers, and it goes off at night and it wakes them up, or they have it on at work. But they wanted to know if they could do it in an app on a phone. And so we helped develop the content. There were technicians and artists involved in developing all this stuff. But they said, can you do this idea model for a warning on a phone? And this is also based on the fact that some of the idea model parallels very closely with the warning criteria developed by people like Dennis Milletti over the years, if you know that name. And so we said, sure, let's give it a try. And on the right, you can see some of the different kinds of variations we came up with: a map for internalization. For action, we have a visual that drop, cover, and hold on. For explanation, letting them know that it's shaking, and for how long, very strong shaking. And how we presented that. So real quickly.
Earthquake, very strong, shaking, expected in 3 seconds.
That's the control message. That's what was you could get on your computer. And here's just a quick example of what we came up with.
Earthquake, drop, cover, hold on.
So it gives you a map, gives you intensity, gives you and and keep in mind that when I say we came up with, it's a big we, okay, big we. We had there's a lot of experiment, a lot of technology, a lot of design that went into that. But we measured it on affective, cognitive, and behavioral learning. And from an affective standpoint, people did think that this was across conditions, both the treatment and the control do raise people's understanding of that, how this risk affects them. And as far as our effort at internalization with our map, that too was seen as very, very important across conditions. And our cognitive learning, again, it worked, some of what we saw, what kind of shaking, it actually worked better on the app because we had less information. And the map was pretty much equally effective on the treatment, though it was more effective for the app actually, because part of it was geo-centered. I mean, they knew where they were. It was, their phone wouldn't go off unless it was their location. So we had that going for us. And then the strong shaking was clear, but the true difference between them came in the utility of it and people's willingness to use it in terms of behavior. Would they, would they take cover? Yes. Would they do all these things? It was all taking no action, very little. Would they download the app? Would they use the app? In general, the measures were quite positive. And we would argue that we were able to make good use of this whole model, even in a very short and brief process like that. So here we are, trying to understand instructional communication and its elements with something like the pandemic, and then also with something as fast as an earthquake. I thought that's real interesting. But keep in mind that with the pandemic and it's how long it is, it's kind of like Maureen was saying, we're constantly starting over. There are new phases, there are new messages. It's not like we had one pandemic message. We're just going and going and going and testing and reacting and that kind of, call it improvisation, call it agility, but we just keep moving on and developing these kinds of things. So again, we're looking at our future work. We're really focusing on more with engaged dialogue to help us understand internalization, distribution. We continue to look at the multifaceted nature, a lot of understanding explanation, but how do you share science, with engaging your audience, and somehow, when possible, as in the biosecurity, we're looking at almost a co-creational dimension of action where the farmers were able to participate in that process. But at this point, I feel like I've talked a long time and given you a lot of information and hit the outer edge of my time limit, but I'm sure open for any questions and you can always email me.
Sorry, I've got another one.
What's that?
I've got another question, if that's okay. I'm just wondering if you've tested the negative case, particularly on that app, but for example, if an earthquake happens and the app doesn't work, does it make people less likely to respond quickly because they think, oh, it's fine, the app hasn't gone off?
Oh, that's a really scary point. Yeah, that's a good, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, obviously I'm aware of that being a problem, but we have not tested that. No.
Just again, that comes directly from my fire experience because we had the Fires Near Me app, and in some places it didn't update accurately enough, and so people had 10 seconds to get out of the house.
Wow! Oh, that's horrible.
They didn't have the accurate data, and so I'm just wondering, as a broader principle, can we over-condition people to having the information such that they are too used to relying on instruction and don't take initiative?
Yeah, I'm sure that's a possibility. And there are always people that will say it's not hot in here because the thermostat says it's such and such degrees. And other people who say that I don't trust that thermostat, I'm opening windows or whatever, there are people that it's funny. You see some people that I've been on the golf course and they use these apps to tell you how far the hole is away. And they don't always, right? Some of them are not, they're not equal. And so I've seen people that totally rely on them, and I've seen some people who won't even use them at all. And I've seen them both make mistakes. But that's how we are. Some of us are so, give me an app and I won't believe it's an earthquake until my app goes off. And others will, be completely tech-free. They want to be, they think they're trusting their intuition. So people are different. So we're not going to wreck a whole population, but there is that danger of people over being, it's like us with hurricane weather here. I can become, if they tell me it's going to be a 3, I get concerned. But if they tell me it's going to be a 2, then I don't do anything. I barely even bring my furniture in. And if it suddenly turns into a 3, I'm in big trouble. So I'm
not sure if it's apocryphal, but apparently hurricanes named after women kill more people because they are taken less seriously because they have female names.
All I know is that I worry about myself becoming desensitized. We have so many now.
Mm-hmm. We used to have tornadoes, like tornadoes in Oklahoma when we lived there, and our neighbors lost their house in a tornado, and then they were very sensitive. So every time there was a storm, like anywhere in the state, they'd be, in their shelter, and they had, wine down there. And so they'd sit in their chairs and drink wine and wait for it to pass.
Well prepared.
But, we were like, look, I got a map. The TV says it's way over here, we're fine.
Yeah.
Give us a call and we'll run over there if something happens.
Oh, and I can remember in Kentucky, they rarely touch down. I don't know why, at least where I was in Lexington when I lived in Kentucky, and we'd go out on our deck and look at them. Man, that's really good. That's a good one. And we knew we could run to the basement, or at least we thought we could. But you'd hear the siren and you'd go outside to look for when we heard the siren, we didn't go to the basement. We went outside to look. It's just wrong, So yes, I'm sure, Aaron, that if we're not careful, that we could desensitize people to the very danger we're trying to protect them from with some of this technology. Any other questions? I don't want to. It's Friday there. It's not Friday here yet.
I know.
Well, I have a quick question though. How about the misinformation or disinformation toward the desensitized person or a desensitized group of people? What kind of actions that health organizations or I'm not quite sure that is there an effective way to debunk all the disinformation? It worked to helping out the speed up our right message toward for example, like vaccinations. I found anti-vaxxers kind of misinformation kind of history of the same message, right? So I just wonder.
Yeah, and there are very few truisms, that we're always understanding context. But I do know this. I do know that when misinformation or disinformation comes into play, the longer we wait in sending a counter message, the worse off we are. That's the one thing I will say that I have seen, no matter what the context is, that the sooner one can provide a counter message, the better. Now, please understand, if you study image, there are a lot of situations where some criticism comes up, and if the company responds to it too quickly, it can draw attention to the situation where that might otherwise fade away. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you're talking about, the anti-vaxxers and those kinds of things, where you've got a problematic message out there, and the longer it takes for a credible institution that's whose authority is being questioned to respond, the worse off we are. That's the one thing I'll say. And the other is the thing that we're getting so good at monitoring. there are so many better ways to monitor information now. We used to get big grants at the University of Kentucky just to monitor media for people because we had a lab and we could do that. Now you can do that yourself. There are different ways to do it, and dashboards for measuring social media and things, that all of which I don't even understand that well, but monitoring is important. So that, why? So that you can respond quickly. I don't know if that's just one little piece of the answer, Chris. I know there's a lot more to be discussed.
Well, Facebook, I don't know how new it is, but they've started having this where some messages will come through and they'll have this sort of automatic debunking. And I've seen it a couple times, but in my experience, it's usually something stupid, like a picture from The Wizard of Oz, and they're like, well, actually, this didn't really happen. There was no Wicked Witch. And you're like, I'm pretty sure everyone knew that. I haven't seen them doing it with any real critical messages, but that seems like, if they were vigilant, that has great potential to deal with some of these issues. It's just sort of quick, instantaneous, almost refutation of the lies.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I'm fascinated by it, and savvy users use it, and it helps. And we have a lot to do. Also, there's a lot of questions to be answered about the algorithms, about what kind of news gets pushed into people's feeds too. I'm still wanting to hear more answers there.
Okay. Anyone else? Shima?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, team. It was a great example of when we have an excellent model, but we face a lot of complexities when we put it into practice, and how those complexities varies from one context to another.
Oh, thank you. And it's just construction. It's theory construction. It's not theory proving. Sorry. You don't really prove theories. You test them and build them and construct them, and then they prove reliable,
Okay, well, why don't we wrap it up, because it's nighttime where Tim is, and they just passed a bunch of nasty anti-voter rights laws in Florida. I got an announcement on my phone about, so.
Oh, really? See, our Congress, yeah, they work at night here, yeah. Yeah, I knew it was coming. But anyway, I think I'll go watch the National Football League, American football draft. That's more.
All right, well, I appreciate it, and thank you everyone for coming this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whatever it is for you. And Tim's happy to talk to you, he says, if you want to send him a message.
Yeah. Stay well, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you later. I'm going to stop the recording now.